The Butterfly's Dream by Kerber's 314, Chapter 23, Subtlety, Part 2.
Go ahead and freeze that lock. The order was completed, not without its share of sideways glances and stubborn hostility, which by then were becoming rather irritating. Before Ruby could reach out and pluck the brittle metal of the hinge like a ripe strawberry, she jerked her hand back to keep it from being pinned there by the needling point. Before we go in there, Ruby refused to meet her partner's baleful stare, denying its validity. I need to know, did Ospin give you strict orders on this mission? Did he specifically ask me to partner with you? No way around it. Ruby looked her friend and me in the face with a piercing stare she could tell made Weiss uncomfortable, and told the truth. No, it was an admission of mistrust, not only for the operation itself, but for her partner. If worse came to worse and the you-know-what hit the you-know-what, then Ruby would prefer to have two people she could trust on the outside to bail her out if necessary. As disheartening as it was, back then she couldn't rely on the other girl not to leave her in the lurch in that scenario, and thus wanted her chained to the hip. Surprisingly, Weiss nodded in acceptance before quietly prying open the cloudy skylight and slipping into the darkness. There was no doubt that the same thoughts had passed through her head, otherwise she would not have asked the question. However, it seemed that she either appreciated the candor or respected the calculated decision. That, or she had similar thoughts about her leader's real, re, reliability. As insulting as the doubt might have been, Ruby took no offense as she followed swiftly after her partner, padding along silently on the metal catwalk. What awaited them in the warehouse would surely cure her of the notion. Ick, this place is filthy. Icy daggers glared out from the darkness as Ruby clamped a hand on Weiss's mouth, a finger pressed to her own lips. Get your hands off of me! Ruby complied with a widespread show of disarrangement, but continued her shushing stare with a look of admonishment that made Weiss bristle. No surprise that the girl didn't like being told to keep quiet, and to have it delivered by someone who she still considered her inferior was unacceptable. Look, if we're going to work together, Weiss! There was a clear distinction between the earnest suggestion previous and the voice Ruby used now. The former required a hand to silence. This only needed a whisper. Shut up! It was a weighted decision to partner up with Weiss for this task, just as it was for me to slip the tiniest hints of my influence through that rift. There was no question how dangerous riling Ruby up could be, but the annoying one needed to be silent, for in that moment I thought I heard something. Move! The older girl's face never had time to release itself from the jaw-dropping shock as Ruby barreled into her, tackling the two of them out of the way as the rocket careened into the suspended catwalk. The blast blew all the skylight outward and sent them tumbling over one another across the cheese grater metal. Ears were still ringing when their aura began to restore sensation to their battered limbs from being dragged across the corrugated gangway. Hearing returned just in time to catch the stomach-churning sound of metal whining under the strain of its own weight, jerking out from underneath them seconds later with a shriek like a banshee. By then they were fully geared up, though, and their eardrums hadn't been damaged enough to throw off their senses off balance when they leapt from the folding walkway into the wide-open center of the large building. Incoming! Sense of stealth lost anyway, Ruby issued a giddy war cry as she caught movement far below, angling herself towards the shapes with her cape acting like a rudder. The woman's ironically ruby red sunglasses reflected the tread of her boot as the last thing before her foot shattered them, along with the man's nose and likely jaw, if the multiple snaps she heard were correct. Hiya! Standing up after just flattening one of their comrades like the pancake that Nora so adored, Ruby waved nonchalantly to a dozen or so identically dressed henchmen, for what else could they be with their charcoal pine strip shirt, matching fedoras and gaudy eyewear. Whatever else might be said about their quality, they didn't immediately retreat after her entrance, though that could be because these people were more used to the classical idea of power, gangsters and murderers and giant monsters. I should know. To me, nothing was quite as frightening as the pure confidence exuded from her right then. The speak of essence I lent her had long since burned off, and this was all her, maybe taking a page from Naruto, but making it her own like those dreaded puppy dog eyes. She didn't even need her scythe to be drawn to be seen as a very vengeful spectre descending from the heavens to smite the wrongdoers. Oh, and then there was Weiss. She completely ruined the building atmosphere by landing hard on one of her heels and snapping the post, and keeling over onto her rump in a most undignified manner. Ugh, Ruby threw her hands into the air in frustration. You ruined it! Now, I wouldn't say that quite yet. There was a crackling buzz like a swarm of flies as old electric lamps flicked on, following the sticky sweat sound of the new voice. Ruby suddenly found herself in the spotlight as the men around her backed away from center stage. One hand shielding her eyes, she squinted into the patchy darkness, never losing the cocksure smile plastered on her face. A little rough around the edges, I'd still say this is quite a performance so far. Admittedly, I'm not normally one for high school plays, or is this a sideshow act? The dripping arrogance and flippant attitude were more noticeable than all the illuminated thugs, and she homed in on their source through the blinding light being directed to her. At her, it laughed a waltz in two steps as handcrafted leather shoes attacked their way down a set of metal steps. Truly, this is a surprise. I thought for sure the cops caught on to us and would send some poor boring saps to investigate, and we'd have to deter them from poking their noses where they don't belong. Realizing what kind of danger they had suddenly found themselves in, Weiss quickly cast off her busted footwear and backed her way to Ruby's side, the goons parting to allow her access to that stalwart lighthouse. Still standing stock still standing stock still with a beaming grin on her face. You see, I really like this place and I'd like to keep it if at all possible. Do you know how hard it is to find somewhere in the right neighborhood with the right atmosphere for the right price, where people won't come snooping around all the time? The man chortled, waltzing into one of the patches of illumination without a care. What am I talking about? You're just kids, probably still living at home with your mummies and daddies. You've got no idea what kind of rough and tumble world real life is like. Either not noticing or not caring that both she and Weiss were armed, nothing was lost on Ruby as she sought out the face to match the voice and the drama that was being acted out. Or was it a farce? For this was none other than Roman Torchwick, the mugshot far more flattering than this pasty-faced ginger, whose tongue was not quite as sharp as his dress. The wanted poster, which had flashed by on screen in the bullhead over to Beacon, just before Glinda's holographic intro, must have been from several years prior, if nothing else. The time had healed the bruises, though it had done nothing to abroad the greasiness, which only seemed to even more intense in person. Come to think of it, he stopped, Kane coming to a clacking halt as he placed the contemplative finger on his chin. What are two kiddies doing out here so late? How did you get in here? Through the roof, duh, Ruby stated with a derisive huff before her partner could do anything but look at her with withering scorn. Cute! His chuckles were fake regardless that it was impossible to tell if he meant so now. But seriously, what are two young and impressionable ladies such as yourself doing poking around the warehouse district? Didn't your parents ever warn you not to stay out at night? My parents also warned me not to talk to strangers, so you're kind of stuck there. By this time, Weiss would have strangled her captain had there not been the very real possibility of needing her help to escape this incredulously worrisome scenario. Oh, but my dear, I'm not some mere stranger. I'm your friendly neighborhood malefactor. Why, even that's being a little harsh. You seem like the type of girl into fairy tales. I'm more of a Robin Hood archetype than anyone else. My name is Roman Torchwick, and now that we have that established, we need your names to seal the deal. Hmm? That was no minding the There was no minding the threatening glare seen out of the corner of her eye by her partner, warning her not to divulge anything. It really didn't matter at this point. Now that the man had seen their faces, he couldn't let them escape anyway. No thanks. My parents said that strangers are just friends you haven't met yet, but I think I prefer you as a stranger. I don't think you quite understand the situation here, dearie. With a flick of his cane, the diorama of Drogs slowly came to life, lumbering closer to them. You see, I'm not a bad guy. Well, I kind of am. but I prefer not to get my hands dirty if I can help it. But you're not exactly making that easy for me. So why don't we avoid a heartache all around and just cooperate, huh? Just come along and we can have a nice chat, maybe with some milk and cookies. Stay back. Weiss had by this time exhausted her patience and drew Mertonaster with a flick of her wrist, leveling it at a handful of henchmen who decided to take a cautionary step back. Oh, now that's interesting. Roman turned his focus to the other girl for the first time, giving her a predatory look, which was surely 100 times worse than all the psychopaths and leeches populating her father's blue blood parties. You two aren't just lost little girls, are you? Come to think of it, you look kind of familiar. He jabbed his spun aluminum cane with a perfectionary wet tip at the sneaky Harris. Where have I seen you? Magazine somewhere? TV? Not knowing just makes me even more curious as to who sent you. Konoha? Ruby blurted out, lassoing attention towards her once again. A strange and not altogether smart thing to say. It did have the desired effect of eschewing attention from her partner. Were ninjas sent by Konohagakure, the village hidden in the leaves? Never having been in this kind of situation before, did the pressure perhaps get to her, or did she just enjoy seeing the perplexed look on all the adult faces? Your friend's a little slow, isn't she? This rhetoric back at the white-haired girl, who now looked more embarrassed than frightened. No, I'm fast. Torchwick blinked. For the moment that he turned his attention away from the girl in red, she had disappeared, and the chilling, coy response wafted like icy breath on the back of his neck. What? Even before stumbling in his attempt to turn around and confront the impossibly fast girl, the man knew he was dead. There was an eternity in which to listen to the bladed weapon uncoiling and sliced through the metal staircase like butter. The only thing Roman Torchwick could think of in that moment was how he didn't get paid nearly enough for this crap. Cling! Fuck! The huntresses! Perhaps realized a little too late, the career criminal still managed to blurt this out as he vaulted over the handrail and onto the warehouse floor, death staved off for just a moment by the impeccable timing of his partner. He quickly wiped off his black lacquered cane to direct the tip-turned muscles at Ruby, but held back as she was kept in a deadlock by his bodyguard, confident. Ruby blinked at the introduction of this new player. A girl, not unlike her in stature, was bending out crescent ropes with a blade no thicker than a pencil drawn forth from a parcel. In between frames, she could have sworn that the pink eyes now stared at her had at first been brown, or was it white, or perhaps some combination of the three, like her opponent's hair. What are you guys waiting for? An invitation? Get them! At that signal, Ruby slid both of their weapons downward, blasting an explosive round into the landing as she leapt over the human impediment. Her target was still Torchwick, as it was obvious he had the information they sought. Noticing the pouncing creature, the man stopped retreating and redirected his weapon back to the red and black target before she could even begin to deal with what was most likely a similar rocket as had surprised them before. Torchwick diverted his attention to the immediate issue of the other girl rushing at him with a skewering thrust. The missile flew astray, and Ruby cursed as Weiss got in her path, forcing her to the ground prematurely as the explosion knocked a few more metal chunks from the dilapidated roof. Crouched low to the ground like an animal, she growled like one at her partner, now engaging Roman in a loose duel, where the man held his own by brutalizing the girl's precious strikes. There was no time to be preoccupied with this, however, as the dollop henchmen rushed her with her red machetes to match their glasses. Out of my way! Not expecting such a burst of speed, despite the prior evidence, three goons were instantly taken out by a single blow, sweeping their legs. Leaping over these, another one became ensnared in a slow swoop, which caught him up and hurled him at his cohorts, knocking a half-dozen over like bowling pins. A brutal backhand clotheslined the next, and she threw herself over a low tackle from behind, slamming the butt of her scythe into another gut and heaving the man over her head to toss him at the nearest group, who crumbled under their comrade's weight. Standing upright with the twirl of her menacing weapon, she had no chance to appreciate the semi-stunned looks on the dial crooks before she stepped out with an upward swinging to parry the airily silent stab. to her back. With her blade over her head, she brought it down on top of the diminutive woman, who held it at bay with almost no visible strain. "You're pretty good, aren't you?" Ruby asked with a cockeyed smile that leaked a little bit of savagery. The only reply she got was an almost mirrored smirk, which seemed to say, "Same to you," before the other woman ghosted around her blade to strike low to her thigh. Batting this away with the shaft, Ruby twirled the load to reciprocate the gesture before completing the 720 and striking high when the other one jumped to avoid. A move reminiscent of the Konoha Senpu, which succeeded at least in knocking the other woman back when she was forced to plug mid-air. With that distraction out of the way, Ruby shot after her partner, coming up behind Torchwick before he could ever know she was there and bludgeoning him on the back of his head. "What do you do? Why'd you do that for?" Ruby ignored the indignant remark as she turned around and started shooting at the man's more skilled partner as she rushed over to stop them, nailing her good in the chest with a standard round. She was confident the multicolored swordswoman was down for the count, but lingering on her crumbled form for a few seconds before daring to appraise the situation. "What the hell, Ruby? He was mine." Weiss was not letting the interruption of her match go, and forced her captain to look at her with an arm latched around her bicep. Both the childish indignation and the weak grip were broken effortlessly as Ruby shrugged off her partner's accusation. "This isn't a game, Weiss." Whereas Ruby's words were childish and broad, her thoughts were focused like a hand lens. It was opposite with Weiss, who had yet to begin to take their duty to heart or even to mind. She already had the appropriate expression on her face when Ruby slapped her out of the way harshly, though getting shoved was by far a more preferable outcome than getting impaled by that parasol blade. The razor edge skittering noisily against the scythe, the captain injected between the two. "I didn't hit you." Ruby sounded more ecstatic than upset with this revelation. Finding someone who could keep her on her toes at long last, and who appeared to have similar abilities as her own, there was no playful silent banter between them this time. Not only was she totally unscathed by the shot, but her visage had re-solidified with a stony ferocity, and this time Ruby certainly remembered those hateful brown eyes being rosy pink. She wasn't going crazy. Well, not yet anyway. "Gotcha, Red." Now that one noticed. However, perhaps those eyes were a distraction, a trap like Narcissus Pond or the legendary Sharingan. For, in the moment of reflection, Ruby misplaced herself and allowed Roman to get up behind her back, locking his arms underneath her shoulder around the back of her head. Where was Weiss? "Now, Neil, finish her!" Like Ruby, this girl, now appropriately named Neil, allowed herself to savor the victory a modicum too long before she struck, long enough for Ruby's partner to reacquaint herself with the battle, thrusting both of their blades down low and forcing the other girl back with superior poise and precision. Not one to ever waste an opportunity, Ruby seized this chance to coil herself into her chest and spring outwards again with a violent upward kick. Eep! However unlikely it was that the man was getting up after having her boot foot having jammed hard on his on-off button, she was taking no chances. With a half-turn on her heel, she slapped him upside the head with the flat of Crescent Rose like a golf ball. Then she turned to her partner's fencing match, long enough to decide that she couldn't intervene this time, not out of consideration for a fair match, but because she saw the panicked look in her opponent's eyes as she loomed over the defeated Torchwick. Now was as good a time as any. Finishing a red-tipped round from a single loop sewn into her leggings, she popped it into the chamber of Crescent Rose and shot it off towards one of the ruptured skylights. A long crimson streak followed it upwards into the night sky, where it exploded like a firework. This was the signal for Blake and her sister to come as back up, assuming that Torchwick hadn't brought any more goons with him. It would be nice to have some extra bodies to pin down the bullish Neo, who insisted on continuing to fight even more desperately than before as she recognized the urgency behind that signal flare. The girl went berserk and threw out all decorum, actually grabbing the tip of Mertonaster and yanking Weiss towards her so she could deliver a vindictive knee to the girl's crotch, something which I can assure from experience is equally unpleasant for the female as the male. Surprising a wince and a growl as she saw it happen, Ruby crouched defensively over the unconscious criminal and started unloading at the only body still upright. That unearthly rumbling in her chest only grew as was continually unable to hit the slippery woman. Neo kept appearing to get hit by her pinpoint accuracy only to shatter the illusion a moment later when a sixth sense told her to replace another round downrange. At least she was keeping the girl away from the downed Weiss though, but the longer this carnival game went, the more nervous she was getting with the fact that their teammates hadn't arrived yet and her minimal accoutrement of ammunition was running low. With the next frustration shot, Neil failed to reappear, and a sinking dread grabbed Ruby as she nervously scanned the dim chamber. No land-bound being ever seemed to look upwards for danger, so this is exactly what Ruby did. Like a bird of prey, Neil perched herself on a crossbeam, Roman's cane cradled in one hand with her parasol hung off the other. A dangerous, coy smile that Ruby recognized on her face. Fear and anger both burbled in Ruby's gut as Neil raised the disguised rocket launcher, not pointing it at her, but the simpering Weiss, who was still clueless with her head to the ground to avoid the friendly fire. No thought was required for Ruby to shoot off towards her comrade, keeping just ahead of the missile, which already had a good head start. She scooped the body up without halting her semblance and crashed into one of the metal loading bay doors as a result. But her throbbing head and shoulders were the least of her worries as the projectile detonated upon contact with the ground. No windows to allow decompression. The concrete floor propagated the concussive blast through the floor, blinding the both of them and almost launching them out the loading dock as the shuttered door buckled and bulged and were nearly blown off their hinges. Being thrown clear would have been better, for in that moment they were like toddling infants crawling around on all fours, blind and deaf to the structure caving down all around them. The walkway had seen enough abuse and was now letting go from its supporting struts, both snapping like twigs. Ruby regained awareness just in time to notice the moribund ground as the metal dove down upon them. She had unfortunately dropped Crescent Rose when they were blasted away and had no time to retrieve it, so it was with an almost forlorn resign that she raised her hands to the sky again, the weight of the world coming to crush them for all the good it might do. Part of her might have lamented Naruto's absence at that moment, longed for him to come and save her, but an even greater part of her despaired her own helplessness, the fact that no matter how hard she seemed to try, the universe always seemed to be against her. Naruto might have felt that he wasn't fast enough, but he had means to game the system. Where was her cheat code? That despair quickly turned to frustration, then to rage, all within the few seconds it took for the axe to drop. She screamed a denial into the sky so that it might reach the shattered moon, or even the broken gods which watched over them. I'd like to take credit for what happened next, but alas, this is another one of those things which yet remain a mystery. Though my influence might have had something to do with it, the power had long been cooped by the strong-willed woman who had molded it into something of her own. Like that moment before at the cliff, there was a crimson lightning bolt which descended from the heavens, cleaving the walkway in half before it could impact the two huntresses. This is the way I describe it, but it is perhaps a misconception, as lightning travels both ways. It smiles from the sky just as much as it is hurled back into the clouds. This was perhaps the latter, and that ionizing bolt of crimson electricity spawned from her energetic fury, rejecting all gods and men who would not stoop to save her in her moment of need. Regardless, it was nothing short of divine. The two pieces of molten metal and accompanying slag fell to either side of the two, parting like a curtain. Ruby breathed heavy, staring at the glassy fulgurate under her feet and feeling the stars twinkling on the back of her head through the gap in the now open ceiling. You! Weiss was still gasping for breath just as hard, even though she hadn't done anything, staring at Ruby with what might have been awe, possibly horror, or maybe some kind of twisted combination of the two, which we can call respect. As she noticed the presence of her partner, though, Ruby reawakened to the knowledge of others in the building, ignoring the groaning and possibly flattened bodies of the henchmen strewn about. She scanned the debris field, looking for two in particular. She cursed and let herself collapse onto the still scalding hot ground when she realized that they were gone. Damn it! She muttered, hoping no one other than Naruto had heard her and praying that he didn't bring it up. Ruby! There wasn't even energy left in her to turn her head at the call, still holding a conversation with the hissing and popping of ground. Ruby, are you all right? Speak to me. 5 more minutes, please, she mumbled weakly, dunking her sister in the nose as she tried to shut her off like an alarm clock. Rubes, gang, can't breathe. Come on now, partner. Can't go killing your sister after we rescue her, can we? Blake rolled her eyes at the siblings carrying on before turning to the oddly quiet Weiss. You okay? Yeah. She began tentatively trying to lift herself to her feet before letting out a painful whiz when she put weight on her right leg. Weiss, released from her sister's crushing embrace and propped up, Ruby could see the unintended consequences of her desperate actions. The perfectly pale skin from Weiss's ankle to her calf was now puckered and torn, blisters raised and popped from the proximity to the intense heat. There was even the possibility of muscle underneath the seared flesh poking out, but no one wanted to look too closely. Weiss, I'm so sorry. Ruby was on the verge of tears and reaching out for her partner, desperately, fully prepared to be rebuked harshly and painfully, receiving as good as she gave. Don't worry about it. Huh? But Weiss was not looking at her distraught captain, and rather at the hulking and twisting skeletons of metal heaped all around them, busy reminiscing on her own uselessness. It's just a scratch. Don't worry about it. Clenching her jaw so that the sound of teeth grinding could drown out her pained whispers as she slapped away an offered hand from Blake so that she could stand on her own 2 feet. Well, her own feet plus Myrtanaster, once more or less upright. She leaned heavily on her sword to catch her breath before attempting anything else. I'm just annoyed that we let those two escape. Who says we did? Blake jerked on the hand which had rested to her side the entire time, calling forth, or rather dragging into the flickering light, a bound and gagging Neo, hogtied to the dead weight which was Roman Torchwick, just barely coming out of consciousness. I told her this was a bad plan. Any plan in which you lose your hat is a bad plan, he lamented to his partner groggily, seemingly to the small woman's intense ire. You caught them? Ruby asked, the tattoo dumbfounded, standing up with little support from her sister. Of course, Yang puffed her chest out proudly. Couldn't let you have all the fun. A sweeping hand to the utter destruction and chaos, bodies strewn everywhere that no one wanted to check and see were unconscious or otherwise. Not much fun in this, Ruby muttered darkly, not bemoaning their success, but reminding all of them that that amusement was not the reason they took missions, and that there was never any glory in death. Lighten up, Blake surprised them all with her admonishment. It looks like we caught the culprits behind the dust robberies, so we can pretty much call this case closed when we deliver these two to the authorities. And how do you plan to do that exactly? Weiss gestured to her bum leg and then to the prisoners who would in no way be able to hobble themselves the long march to the police station. Furthermore, how do you think we're going to explain this to them? I mean, sure, Torchwick is a known criminal, but we're just Beacon students, and I highly doubt Ospin will admit to sending us out on this kind of job. Ruby would have denied that unfair assessment of their headmaster, but knew that it would be hypocritical. It was true that Ospin hadn't officially recorded their missions, and she was surprised her partner figured that out. But if she knew they weren't getting credit for them, then why then did she come along? Wailing sirens in the distance freed them all from having to make their choices. A collective groan and even a little bit of relief overtaking the overstressed students. Well, might as well get this over with, Yang declared, plopping herself down on a horizontal bent piece of pipe. Want me to take a look at that leg for you? Blake offered. All right, the prideful woman relented after a pause in which to consider the severity of pain. Chances were there wasn't any, which meant that the burn was rather serious, deep enough to damage nerves. Still, upper lip aside, she'd probably prefer not to be laid out for days afterwards with an infection. Blake nodded and looped the other end of her ribbon around the sturdy piece of rebar, turning back to her captives with a commanding tone. Stay!
Hardy har, Roman slurred while nails silently seethed. Ruby just then noticed the rather large bruise on her jaw. You know something? Torchwick called over his shoulder in a moment of surprising lucidity. I'm not going to stay locked up for long, that I promise, but I got this inkling that you four are going to be a constant thorn in my side from now on. Especially you, Red. He chuckled teasingly out another moan from his nether regions. I don't rightfully know why, just a feeling, but just so you know, next time I'm not going to show you brats any mercy. You can bet on that. While the threat earned the battered man no few glares from the rest of the team, it was lost on the ones for which it was intended. Ruby, already quickly fallen asleep, curled protectively around the form of Crescent Rose. Did you stay up all night again? It was the loud sigh afterwards that made his eyes flutter open and gaze at his molted stucco ceiling. What are we going to do with you? Make me breakfast? There was a light tapping on the top of his skull with a familiar piece of metal. Ow! Please! He could feel Tenten rolling her eyes. He sat up. Did she keep you up all night again? No, not really, he replied honestly, eye twitching as he found Tenten fondling his scythe, declining to comment though, since it was her handiwork. Instead, he made his way into the kitchen robotically, not needing the brain cells she kept destroying to start this day. She had a mission last night, the comment made offhandedly as he rummaged through his cabinets that were worryingly barren of ramen. Oh, yeah, did a bang up job apparently. Finding two in the way back, he let out a sigh of relief and dragging himself out of the cubby. Knowing you, I take that to be literal, more or less. He again admitted with a shrug of his shoulders and a small grin that was all the energy he had first thing in the morning, climbing down from the counters and setting the cups down in his place. He turned around to clear the table of any drawings that had not been put away. Only when he did, he found the moderately barren surface apart from the neat wicker basket set down in the corner. Tenten? Hmm? What's this? He pointed to the foreign object worrisomely, as if it possibly contained a jack-in-the-box that was going to leap out at him. What? Those things are creepy. The woman, quiet, the quiet futzing with the knots and wails of the weapon to smile at him cheekily. Breakfast. Pausing in this otherwise routine preparations, he swiveled his body to look at her, staring at him with silent, laughing eyes, glistening in the sunlight filtered down through his window. Did I mention how radiant you look today? Flattery will get you nowhere, mister. Shaking his head with a bemused chuckle, he went back to preparing the hot water for Tia alone when he stopped suddenly in his actions. In all the years she had been coming by to drag him out of bed for training missions or just to hang out, this was the first time she had declined the obligatory servings of noodles. I told you that she had a mission today, he reminded himself. Yesterday, that's why the breakfast, it's for her. Figured we'd ought to celebrate somehow. With mock hurt and very real reluctance, Naruto lifted back the napkins covering the contents. You've never made me cake. You don't like cake? Not really, no. Too sweet. He pulled the rudimentary dessert out of the basket, anyway, setting it on the table and turned back around to look for the appropriate silverware. It's the thought that counts, though, or in this case, the lack of it. There should be a knife and some forks in there already, she informed him after sticking her tongue out behind his back at the fastidious jib. He stuck his head in and rummaged around for a bit. Figures, the comment made looking at the utensils which could have been armament themselves with how sturdy they were built. Here, let me. Already by his side, she leaned over and started to dole out individual slices with her usual effortless precision, the rectangular yellow castella quickly going through mitosis. Meanwhile, he took a back seat and admired her handiwork, first at the inspiring baked good, and then to the size she had brought into the kitchen nook, leaning it against the closed wall as if to accompany them in celebration. First up, she handed him a loaded plate, which he took with a nod before serving herself on one exactly as large and sitting down across from him. Make a wish. How about two new adventures? Works for me. No candles were blown out like what he had lived through before. No bright decorations or singing familiar members. No presents with colorful wrappings and idyllically curled bows. And yet the feeling was still there. It's missing something. Teten was the only one to point it out, though. What? She looked dismally at the two large forks resting on her plate. Sugar. Pausing before his second bite, he appraised the spongy morsel before shrugging and completing the action. Chewed, then swallowed. Maybe. He didn't really like sweet things. There was no sugar at all in this, and it was still barely palatable. I think you might want to stick to weapons in the future. That and ramen, she agreed, glaring at the yellow hunk as if considering setting it on fire. Of course, absently finishing off another bite. Food was food. He glanced back at what was officially her masterpiece. What are you going to name it? She asked, looking for any excuse to ignore the unappetizing brick in front of her. Mm, I was thinking about it last night while I was awake. Did Ruby have any suggestions? He shook his head negatively, though there was a small smile still on his lips at how normal this had become in such a short amount of time. There was still a long way to go, and at least the two more people who he needed to tell in short order, but now was time for cake and conversation. Denton would throw out a couple of suggestions, all of them half-hearted and equally rejected on both sides. He even told her my suggestion, to which she looked a little more interested, but still reluctant, since they had long since abandoned the unappealing comestible. I soon lost interest, or maybe I just pretended to, because I still desired to see if they would ask that all-important question. Frighteningly, it seemed as if my own name was slipping from my mind as they spoke. The longer the inane conversation drew on, however, the more my ire with both him and myself increased. Are you trying to be a thorn in my paw? The question came naturally with my irritation, and I only remembered later from whence it came. Thorn. What's up, Naruto? I think the name came to us at nearly the same time, a remote thought acting at an impossible distance to touch us both. Every rose needs its thorns, he said with a small smile. I think I'll call it Radiant Thorn. End of chapter 23.